The dog ran desperately through the streets, barking non-stop. "Get out of here, mutt!" yelled the annoyed pedestrians, but he wouldn't stop. He pleaded for help, always pointing in the same direction. When they finally followed him, what they saw made them cry. Before we start today's story, tell me where you're watching from. Take the opportunity to grab a coffee or settle into the sofa. And please don't forget to support us. You just need to click like and I'll know you enjoy this type of story. So ready? Let's begin. The midday sun beat down on the stone streets of the small town when Max, a young stray with golden fur and expressive eyes, walked alongside his mother through the dusty roads. The female dog, her graying fur revealing her advanced age, limped slightly but never failed to accompany her son in their search for food and shelter. "Look at those two again," muttered Mrs. Carmen from her window, shaking her head with a mixture of irritation and pity. "Always wandering around, messing up the trash." Max paid no attention to the comments. His only concern was taking care of his mother, who in recent days seemed weaker and more tired. He had learned from a young age that she was all he had in the world. When he was just a scared puppy, she had protected him from the rain, shared food when there was barely enough for one meal, and warmed him during cold winter nights. The heat was too intense to keep walking on the open streets. His mother panted heavily, her tongue hanging out as she desperately searched for shade. Max looked around, worried, when he spotted an abandoned lot at the end of the street. It was a place he knew well, full of debris and tall weeds, but it offered several shady spots where they could rest. "Come on, Mom," he seemed to say with a soft bark, directing her towards the makeshift entrance in the lot. The fence was broken in several places, making access easy. She followed him confidently, as she always did. The lot was quiet except for the buzzing of insects and the rustling of dry leaves under their paws. Max found a perfect little spot under a leafy tree where the ground was softer and cooler. His mother lay down gratefully, her flanks rising and falling in a tired but relieved rhythm. For a few minutes, everything was perfect. Max positioned himself beside her, vigilant as always, his ears attentive to any strange sound. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them, creating a dancing pattern of light and shadow on the ground. It was one of the few moments of peace they could share. Then he heard it, a subtle, almost imperceptible sound, like something slowly dragging itself through the undergrowth. Max raised his head, his ears perking up in maximum alert. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, a continuous slithering that made his fur stand on end instinctively. His mother had noticed too. She slowly raised her head, her nose twitching as she caught a scent she couldn't quite identify, but which stirred a deep, primal fear. Her eyes darted nervously, searching for the source of the danger they both felt approaching. Max slowly got to his feet, positioning himself between his mother and the densest vegetation. Every fiber of his being was on high alert. Something was wrong in this place, something that shouldn't be there. The silence of the lot, which moments before had brought them relief, now seemed charged with a menacing tension. The slithering sound grew closer, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, nor a small animal scurrying through the bushes. It was something bigger, something that moved with purpose and a defined direction. Max felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized the sound was heading directly towards them. His mother tried to get up, but age and exhaustion made her movement slow and clumsy. Max growled softly, a warning sound directed at any threat that dared to approach. He didn't know exactly what was coming, but he knew he would have to protect the only family he had, no matter what. The abandoned lot, which seconds before had been a refuge, was now transforming into a trap from which they might not escape in time. The movement in the undergrowth stopped for a moment, creating a tense silence that made Max press himself even closer to his mother. She was trying to get up with difficulty, her hind legs trembling from the effort. Age and exhaustion conspired against her precisely when she most needed agility. Suddenly, among the dry leaves and low branches, something glinted under the filtered sunlight. Max saw the eyes first, two small, cold points that watched him with a predatory intensity that chilled his blood. They weren't the eyes of any animal he knew from the streets. They were different, calculating, dangerous. The vegetation moved again, this time partially revealing the approaching creature. It was a snake, but unlike any Max had ever seen before. Its body was thick, muscular, with scales that reflected the light in an almost mesmerizing way. The creature's length seemed endless, slithering through the undergrowth with a fluidity that was both beautiful and terrifying. Max had never faced a snake of that size. On the streets, he had learned to deal with aggressive dogs, territorial cats, and even some large rats. But this was completely different. Every instinct in his body screamed danger, but he couldn't run, not without his mother. The female dog finally managed to stand, but her movements were slow and unsteady. She recognized the danger immediately. Her years of life on the streets had taught her to identify predators. Her fur bristled, and she let out a low, guttural growl, a sound Max had rarely heard her make. The snake continued its approach, seemingly unhurried. Its movements were calculated, patient, as if it knew its prey had nowhere to go. Max could feel panic rising in his chest, but he fought against it. He needed to think. He needed to find a way to get his mother out of there. He barked once, loud and clear, hoping to scare the creature. But the snake merely paused for a moment before continuing its advance. It was as if it were assessing its prey, deciding on the best attack strategy. Max realized with horror that they had cornered themselves. The tree was behind them, and the lot's fence was too far for them to reach in time. Max's mother took a shaky step back, but stumbled on an exposed root. For a crucial moment, she lost her balance, staggering dangerously. It was precisely at this moment of vulnerability that the snake struck. The movement was too fast for the eyes to follow completely. One moment the snake was yards away, the next its body lunged through the air with lethal precision. Max tried to get in the way, but the creature was too clever. It dodged him and went straight for the easier target. The impact was brutal. The snake wrapped itself around the female dog's body with a force that made Max freeze for a crucial second. His mother let out a sound he had never heard before. Not exactly a bark, not quite a scream, but something between pain, surprise, and pure panic. Max recovered from the shock and immediately lunged forward, his jaws closing on what he could reach of the snake's body. But the creature was too strong, and its scaly skin was tougher than he expected. His teeth barely managed to penetrate, and the snake didn't even seem to notice his attack attempt. The situation deteriorated rapidly. With every second, the snake tightened its grip, and his mother was clearly in distress. Her eyes, always so calm and wise, now reflected a primal fear that broke Max's heart. She tried to move, to fight, but the constricting force of the snake was relentless. Max realized with terrible clarity that he couldn't solve this alone. His mother needed help, and he was just a young dog against a much larger and stronger creature. As much as it hurt to admit it, he needed to seek human help. But that would mean leaving her alone, abandoning her just when she needed him most. The dilemma that formed in Max's mind was the cruelest he had ever faced. Every second that passed was a second less for his mother, but going for help meant abandoning her at her most vulnerable moment. His paws trembled as he ran back and forth, barking desperately at the snake, trying anything that might distract it or make it release its prey. The snake, however, seemed completely focused on its goal. Its muscles contracted in rhythmic waves, each squeeze stronger than the last. Max's mother let out increasingly weaker sounds, her breathing becoming labored and irregular. Her eyes sought out her son's, and in that gaze, Max saw something that devastated him. It wasn't fear for her own life, but concern for him. Even in that terrible moment, she worried more about her son's well-being than her own suffering. It was the same expression she had when protecting him from the rain, when sharing the last crumb of food, when warming him during cold nights. It was pure, unconditional love, the kind only a mother can offer. The realization hit Max like lightning. He couldn't save her alone, but he also couldn't just watch her die. There was only one option, however terrifying. He had to run to the street and find humans who could help. He had to trust strangers, the same people who used to shoo them away and treat them as nuisances. Max took one last look at his mother, memorizing her tired but loving eyes. Then, gathering all the courage he could find, he turned and bolted towards the lot's entrance. Every step he took felt like a piece of his heart being left behind, but he knew it was their only chance. Upon reaching the street, Max was met with the normal bustle of the town. People walked calmly along the sidewalks. Children played in the yards. Shopkeepers arranged their goods. It was a world where everything functioned normally, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding just a few feet away in the abandoned lot. Max ran to the first person he saw, a middle-aged man carrying a shopping bag. He barked desperately, trying to get his attention, jumping towards the lot and back to the man repeatedly. But the man just shooed him away irritably. "Get out of here, mutt! I don't have time for this." Max didn't give up. He ran to a lady sweeping the sidewalk in front of her house. He barked, whined, made every sound he could to convey urgency and desperation. She stopped for a moment, observing the animal's strange behavior, but eventually shook her head and went back to her tasks. "These stray dogs always making noise," she muttered to herself. Despair began to set in as Max ran from person to person. Some ignored him completely, others shooed him away rudely, and a few stopped to watch but didn't understand what he was trying to communicate. Time was running out, and with every minute that slipped away, his mother's chances diminished. Max could feel hot tears streaming down his snout, if dogs can truly cry. The frustration of not being able to communicate, of not being able to explain the urgency of the situation, was almost unbearable. He knew every person on that street by sight. He had passed by hundreds of times, but to them, he was just another stray animal causing trouble. But Max couldn't give up. Not as long as his mother still needed him. Not as long as there was a single chance to save her. Max continued his frantic run through the streets, his desperation intensifying with every person who passed without understanding his plea. His barks echoed between the houses, a sound that to him was a desperate cry for help. But to the residents was just more noise from the many stray dogs inhabiting the town. That's when he spotted Carlos, a young mechanic who was leaving his workshop for lunch. Max had seen this young man several times. He had always noticed that he had a gentler look than most people. Sometimes, Carlos had even thrown him and his mother sandwich scraps. If anyone could understand, perhaps it was him. Max ran directly to Carlos, planting himself firmly in front of him and blocking his path. This time he didn't just bark, he cried. It was a deep, guttural sound that came from somewhere deep and desperate within him. His front paws rose, touching Carlos's chest, his eyes fixed on the young man's with an almost human intensity. Carlos stopped, surprised by the animal's direct approach. There was something different about this dog, something in his eyes that wasn't the usual behavior of an animal begging for food. It was pure urgency, genuine desperation. "Hey, calm down," said Carlos, crouching to be at Max's level. "What's wrong, buddy? Why all the desperation?" Max gained a little hope when he saw that Carlos wasn't shooing him away. He ran a few yards towards the lot, stopped, looked back, and barked again. Then he ran back to Carlos, repeating the movement. His eyes pleaded for understanding, begged the young man to follow him. Carlos frowned, observing the peculiar behavior. He had grown up in the countryside and knew that animals sometimes acted strangely when something was wrong. His grandmother always said that animals had a sixth sense for danger. "You want me to go with you?" Carlos asked, more to himself than to Max. As if understanding every word, Max barked once, loud and clear, running toward the lot again. This time, Carlos decided to follow him. There was something in the animal's urgency that touched an emotional chord he couldn't ignore. But as they began to walk, other people started to notice the strange pair. Mrs. Marta, who lived on the corner, shouted from her window, "Carlos, don't follow that mutt. Those animals only bring trouble." "That's right," agreed Mr. Joachim, who was watering his plants. "Stray dogs always cause trouble. Better to leave it alone." Carlos hesitated for a moment. Maybe the people were right. Maybe it was just a restless dog trying to lead him into a complicated situation. But when he looked at Max again, he saw something that made him change his mind. The animal had stopped running and was now sitting, looking at him with an expression that could only be described as pure pleading. Max knew he was losing Carlos. He could see the doubt in the young man's eyes, the influence of the neighbor's words making him hesitate. In an act of complete desperation, Max approached again and did something he had never done before. He placed his front paws on Carlos's knees and emitted a sound that was almost like a human cry. It was a sound so full of emotion, so clearly a plea for help, that Carlos felt his heart clench. He had raised dogs his whole life and had never seen an animal express such emotional urgency. Okay, said Carlos softly, stroking Max's head. "I'll go with you. Show me what's happening." Max almost fainted with relief. Finally someone had understood. He got up immediately and started running towards the lot, looking back constantly to make sure Carlos was following. As they walked, Carlos couldn't help but think about the strangeness of the situation. There was something about this dog that defied his usual understanding of animal behavior. It was almost as if the animal knew exactly what it was doing, as if it had a plan. They were approaching the abandoned lot, and Max quickened his pace. As they neared the entrance to the abandoned lot, Max grew increasingly agitated. His steps became faster and his glances at Carlos more frequent, as if he wanted to be absolutely sure the young man wouldn't change his mind at the last moment. The urgency in his movements was palpable, every second clearly precious. Carlos began to hear something coming from inside the lot. Muffled sounds he couldn't quite identify. They weren't exactly barks, but something more distressing, more desperate. A strange feeling formed in his stomach, a mixture of apprehension and curiosity that made him quicken his pace. "What the heck is going on in there?" he muttered to himself as Max practically dragged him through the makeshift entrance in the broken fence. As they entered the lot, Carlos immediately realized that the place was quieter than it should have been. There was no usual sound of birds or insects, just those strange muffled sounds that seemed to come from somewhere near the large tree in the center of the space. Max ran directly to the source of the noise, and Carlos followed him, his steps becoming more cautious as they approached. There was something in the air, a tension that put his senses on alert. Growing up in the countryside had taught him to trust these primal feelings. It was when they rounded a pile of debris that Carlos finally saw the scene that would forever change his perspective on animal intelligence and devotion. There, in the shade of the tree, was an old female dog wrapped in the coils of a gigantic snake. The reptile was larger than any Carlos had ever seen in his life. It must have been at least 10 feet long and as thick as an adult man's arm. The creature's strength was evident in the way its muscles contracted around the dog's body. The dog was still alive, but clearly in great distress. Her eyes were open and conscious, but her breathing was labored and irregular. She seemed to be using her last reserves of energy just to keep breathing, each movement a battle against the snake's constricting force. "My God," Carlos whispered, initial shock quickly giving way to the urgency of the situation. Now he fully understood Max's desperation. The dog wasn't being dramatic or exaggerated. He was literally trying to save his mother's life. Max immediately ran to the dog's side, barking at the snake and trying to find a way to help without making the situation worse. Carlos could see the intelligence behind the animal's actions. He knew direct attacks could make the snake squeeze even tighter, so he tried to distract it, make noise, anything that could give his mother a few extra seconds. Carlos felt a wave of admiration mixed with urgency. This dog's devotion was extraordinary. He had run through the streets, faced rejection from dozens of people, all to find help for his mother. It was a level of love and determination that many humans couldn't demonstrate. But admiration wouldn't save the dog. Carlos needed to act, and fast. "Easy, easy," he said, more to himself than to the animals. He tried to recall everything he knew about snakes. They were strong, but also cautious. Any real threat could make them release their prey and flee to protect themselves. The problem was that Carlos had no experience dealing with snakes of that size. A wrong decision could result in the dog's death or even compromise his own safety. But looking at Max, seeing the desperation in the animal's eyes as he watched his mother struggle for every breath, Carlos knew there was no choice. He had to try something. "All right, man," he said to Max, surprising himself with the gentle tone of his own voice. "We're going to bring your mom back." Carlos quickly assessed the situation, trying to recall everything he had learned about snakes during his childhood in the countryside. His grandfather had taught him that most snakes, even large ones, preferred to avoid direct confrontations with humans. But this one seemed so focused on its prey that it might not notice his approach until it was too late. "I need help," Carlos muttered, pulling his phone from his pocket. But as he looked at the screen, he realized there was no signal in the lot. The isolated location and natural interference completely blocked the connection. He was alone in this situation. Max continued to circle the snake, his barks becoming increasingly desperate. The dog had closed her eyes, but Carlos could still see the subtle movement of her chest rising and falling. She was still alive, but time was running out fast. Carlos began to look for something he could use as a tool. The lot was full of debris, pieces of wood, scrap metal, rusty hardware. His eyes fell on an iron rod about 6 feet long, long enough to keep distance from the snake, but strong enough to exert real pressure. "Max," Carlos called softly, surprising himself by speaking to the dog as if he were a human partner. "I need you to stop barking for a moment, okay? You're making her nervous." Incredibly, Max seemed to understand. He stopped barking immediately, but continued to fidget restlessly, his eyes alternating between Carlos and his mother. It was as if he were asking, "Do you have a plan? Can you save her?" Carlos approached carefully, the iron rod in his hands. The snake finally noticed his presence, its head rising slightly to assess this new threat. Its cold eyes fixed on Carlos for a moment, but it didn't release its prey. The young man took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. A part of him wondered if he shouldn't just run back to the street and scream for help. But a glance at Max and his mother was enough to dismiss those thoughts. It had already been a lot of coincidence that Max managed to bring him this far. There wouldn't be time to find more help. With slow, controlled movements, Carlos positioned the rod near the snake's head. His plan was simple: apply enough pressure to make the serpent feel threatened and release the dog, but without harming it in a way that could provoke an even more aggressive reaction. "Here we go," he whispered to himself. "Just let her go. That's all." The first attempt was too cautious. Carlos lightly touched the snake with the tip of the rod, but it only contracted even tighter around its prey. The dog let out a weak sound of pain, and Max let out an anguished whine. Carlos realized he needed to be more decisive. Hesitation could cost the dog her life. On the second attempt, he pressed the rod more firmly at the base of the snake's head, applying constant, threatening pressure. The serpent reacted immediately, its head rising and turning to face this direct new threat. It was exactly the reaction Carlos had expected. For a crucial moment, the snake loosened its grip on the dog slightly to reposition itself and face Carlos. It was a small window, but enough. "Now, Max!" Carlos shouted instinctively, and as if he had perfectly understood the situation, Max lunged forward. But instead of attacking the snake directly, he did something even smarter. He gently grabbed his mother by the scruff of her neck and began to pull her away from the serpent's grip. The combination of Carlos's pressure on the snake's head and Max pulling his mother created exactly the necessary confusion. The snake, facing threats from two different directions, had to make a quick decision: fight or flee. Carlos applied even more pressure with the rod, and the snake finally made its choice. The snake, realizing it was outnumbered and under direct threat, began to uncoil from the dog with rapid, fluid movements. Each released ring was like a small miracle, gradually freeing the suffering body of Max's mother. Carlos maintained constant pressure with the rod, never diminishing the threat. While Max continued to pull his mother away from danger, the final moment was almost surreal. The snake completely uncoiled and, in a swift escape, slithered away through the dense vegetation. In a matter of seconds, it had disappeared completely, leaving only the rustling of leaves as evidence of its passage. Max immediately released his mother and began to sniff and lick her face, checking if she was okay. The dog was clearly exhausted and in pain, her breathing still irregular, but her eyes were open and conscious. She was alive. Carlos dropped the iron rod, his hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had just faced a gigantic snake, something he never imagined doing in his life, and he had emerged victorious. But more importantly, he had been part of an extraordinary rescue. "Is she okay?" Carlos asked, crouching near the two animals. Max looked at him with an expression that could only be described as pure gratitude. It was a look that went beyond species barriers, a deep recognition that this human had answered his call for help. The dog tried to get up, but her legs were still too weak. Carlos extended his hands carefully, allowing her to sniff and get used to his presence before touching her. When she showed no fear, he gently examined her, looking for obvious injuries. "Doesn't seem like anything's broken," Carlos muttered, more to himself. "But she needs veterinary care. That snake's grip could have caused internal injuries." Max seemed to understand every word. He positioned himself near his mother's head, offering her comfort and body warmth. It was impossible not to be moved by the devotion and affection he showed. Even after all the trauma, his only concern was her well-being. Carlos stood up, realizing he needed to find a way to transport the dog out of the lot. She was too weak to walk, and the path to the street had some obstacles that would be difficult for an injured animal to navigate. That's when he heard voices coming from the entrance of the lot. "Carlos, are you in there?" It was Mrs. Marta's voice, filled with concern. "That dog is gone too," added a male voice that Carlos recognized as Mr. Joachim. "Maybe they got into some trouble." Carlos smiled, realizing that the same people who had initially discouraged his decision to follow Max were now worried enough to look for him. "I'm here," Carlos shouted, "and you need to see this." The sound of approaching footsteps made Max slightly tense, but Carlos placed a reassuring hand on his head. "Easy, buddy. They're good people. They'll help." When Mrs. Marta and Mr. Joachim appeared through the undergrowth, their expressions of concern quickly turned to shock. The scene before them was difficult to process. Carlos crouching near a clearly injured female dog, Max standing guard attentively, and a general atmosphere that something extraordinary had happened. "My God, what happened here?" asked Mrs. Marta, her voice filled with surprise. Carlos looked at Max, who returned his gaze with those expressive eyes full of gratitude, and then at the dog, who was now breathing more easily. How could he explain everything that had happened? How could he convey the intelligence, devotion, and pure humanity he had witnessed in this dog? "You won't believe it," Carlos began slowly, "but this dog just saved her mother's life." Carlos recounted the entire story to Mrs. Marta and Mr. Joachim, from the moment Max had run to him in the streets to the confrontation with the giant snake. With every detail he shared, he saw his neighbor's expressions change from initial skepticism to genuine admiration. "A snake that size here in town?" questioned Mr. Joachim, looking around nervously. "I've never seen anything like that around here." "It must have come from the river," Carlos explained. "With the intense heat of the last few days, many animals come looking for water and shade in places they wouldn't normally frequent." Mrs. Marta had crouched near the dog and was watching her with a completely different look than she usually directed at stray animals. There was a new softness in her eyes, an understanding that hadn't existed before. "Look at the sacrifice she made for her son," she murmured, her voice choked, "and how much he risked to save her." Max had positioned himself protectively beside his mother, but showed no aggression towards the humans. It was as if, after Carlos had responded to his plea, he had developed a basic trust in the people present. His eyes alternated between his mother and the faces of the humans around them, watchful but not hostile. "We need to take her to the vet," said Carlos. "I don't know what internal injuries she might have sustained." "Dr. Fernando has a clinic 3 blocks from here," suggested Mrs. Marta. "He's a good man. He won't charge if he knows the situation." Mr. Joachim had taken off his shirt, transforming it into a makeshift stretcher. "We'll carry her together, slowly and carefully." As they approached the dog to lift her, Max initially tensed, growling softly. His body language made it clear that despite his gratitude, he was still his mother's protector and wouldn't allow anyone to hurt her. Carlos crouched down to Max's eye level. "Hey man, we're friends now, remember? We just want to help her get better." There was something almost magical in the way Max seemed to understand not only the words, but the intention behind them. After a moment of hesitation, he moved slightly away, allowing the humans to approach his mother, but he remained close, overseeing every movement. They lifted the dog with extreme care, placing her on the makeshift shirt stretcher. She offered no resistance, but her eyes constantly sought Max, finding comfort in her son's constant presence. The procession towards the veterinary clinic was unique. Carlos and Mr. Joachim carried the dog, Mrs. Marta cleared the way and alerted other pedestrians, and Max trotted alongside the makeshift stretcher, never straying more than a foot from his mother. People stopped on the street to observe the unusual scene. Some offered help, others asked questions, and many simply watched with curiosity and admiration. The story began to spread by word of mouth, the dog who had run through the streets, pleading for help to save his mother from a giant snake. "I've never seen anything like it," commented Mrs. Rosa, who had come out of her shop to see what was happening. "This dog is smarter than many people I know." "And more loyal too," added Carlos, looking at Max with renewed respect. As they walked, Carlos couldn't stop thinking about how he had underestimated the intelligence and emotions of stray animals. Max had demonstrated capabilities that defied everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. Strategic planning, complex communication, perseverance in the face of rejection, and above all, a maternal love that surpassed any self-preservation instinct. When they finally spotted the sign for Dr. Fernando's clinic, Carlos felt a profound relief. They had made it. Max had managed to save his mother. Dr. Fernando's clinic was small but welcoming, with walls painted in soft tones and the characteristic smell of disinfectant mixed with the care dedicated to the animals treated there. When the group arrived at the door, the receptionist initially hesitated. It wasn't common for them to receive stray animals, especially in emergency situations. "Dr. Fernando," Carlos called, quickly explaining the situation. "We have an emergency here." The veterinarian appeared almost immediately, a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes who had dedicated his life to animal care. Upon seeing the dog on the makeshift stretcher and Max beside her, his professional expression softened with understanding. "Bring her to the exam room," he said without hesitation. "And the son can come too. I think she'll be calmer with him nearby." During the examination, Max remained close to the table, his ears attentive to every movement of the veterinarian. When Dr. Fernando used the stethoscope to listen to the dog's heart, Max tilted his head curiously, as if trying to understand what the strange instrument was doing to his mother. "She was very lucky," the veterinarian explained after completing his assessment. "There are no fractures or serious internal injuries. The snake caused some bruises, and she's dehydrated and in shock, but nothing that a few days of rest and care won't fix." Max seemed to understand that the news was good. His tail began to wag slightly, the first sign of genuine joy he had shown since the crisis began. "How much will the treatment cost?" Carlos asked, already mentally calculating how much he could pay. Dr. Fernando looked at the scene before him, the young dog who had moved heaven and earth to save his mother, the neighbors who had come together to help, the elderly dog who had survived an impossible situation. "For a story like this," he said with a gentle smile, "I won't charge anything, but I have a condition." Carlos frowned. "What?" "I want you to consider giving these two a home. They've shown today that they have more character and loyalty than many humans. They deserve to have a family." Mrs. Marta and Mr. Joachim exchanged glances. Carlos could see something changing on their faces, the same transformation he himself had experienced. These were no longer just stray dogs causing problems. They were individuals with personalities, emotions, and a capacity for love that inspired admiration. "I'd love to keep them," said Carlos, "but I live in an apartment that's too small for two dogs." "My house has a large yard, Mrs. Marta offered hesitantly, "and after what I saw today, I think it would be an honor to care for them." Max looked from one person to another, as if following the conversation and understanding that they were deciding his future. But his greatest concern was still his mother, who rested peacefully on the examination table, breathing regularly for the first time in hours. Dr. Fernando prepared some medication and explained the necessary care for the dog's complete recovery. "In a week, she'll be good as new," he assured them. "And I don't think I'll ever forget today's story." As they prepared to take the two animals to Mrs. Marta's house, Carlos had a profound realization. That morning, he had left home as usual, not imagining that his day would be transformed by an encounter that would forever change his perspective on intelligence, devotion, and the capacity of animals to teach us about unconditional love. Max had done more than save his mother. He had united a community, created human connections that didn't exist before, and demonstrated that communication between species went far beyond words. When they left the clinic, Max walked with a new dignity. He was no longer a stray dog with no place in the world. He was a hero who had proven that true love knows no barriers of species, age, or circumstance. His mother was saved. They had a home, and an entire community had learned a lesson about hasty judgments and the extraordinary capacity for love that exists in the animal kingdom. 3 months passed since that transformative day in the abandoned lot. Mrs. Marta's house had become a true home for Max and his mother, who now went by the affectionate name of Hope, a name chosen by Mrs. Marta herself to represent all that she symbolized. The yard, which had once been just a functional space, had been transformed into a small paradise for the two dogs. Mrs. Marta had installed a comfortable doghouse, always filled feeders, and even some toys that Carlos had bought during his regular visits. Hope had recovered completely. but her experience had made her even closer to Max. They were inseparable, and any visitor could immediately notice the special bond they shared. It wasn't just the normal relationship between mother and son. It was the connection between two souls who had faced the impossible together and survived. Max had become a local celebrity in the neighborhood. His story had spread beyond the streets where he had desperately run for help. Children from the neighborhood came to visit him, fascinated by the hero dog who had saved his mother from a giant snake. He greeted each visitor with dignity, but always kept a protective eye on Hope. Carlos continued to be a regular visitor. The experience had created a special bond between him and Max. They were battle companions who had faced an extraordinary situation together. During his visits, Carlos often reflected on how a simple act of listening to a desperate animal had changed not only the lives of the two dogs, but the entire dynamic of the neighborhood. "You know," Carlos said to Mrs. Marta during one of his afternoon visits, "before that day, I thought I understood animals, but Max taught me that I knew nothing about the depth of their emotions." Mrs. Marta smiled, watching Max play gently with Hope in the yard. "They taught me about hasty judgments. For years, I saw these stray animals as problems to be solved. I never thought of them as individuals with stories, feelings, families." The transformation was not limited to Mrs. Marta. The entire neighborhood had changed its perspective on stray animals. Several other families had adopted abandoned dogs and cats, and an informal care network had formed to ensure that no animal in the area went without. Mr. Joaquim had become an active advocate for animal rights, often sharing Max's story with anyone willing to listen. "That dog has more character than many politicians I know," he used to say, always eliciting laughter and agreement from his audience. Dr. Fernando had also been transformed by the experience. He had established a free care program for stray animals, funded by donations from the local community that had been inspired by Max and Hope's story. As the sun set on another peaceful day, Max positioned himself near Hope, as he did every afternoon. His eyes watched the horizon with a serenity that hadn't existed before. There was no longer the watchful, anxious gaze of someone constantly needing to search for food and shelter. It was the peaceful gaze of someone who had found their place in the world. Max's story had proven something that many humans forget in their rushed, self-focused lives. The true intelligence is not measured solely by the ability to solve complex problems, but by the capacity to love unconditionally, to persevere in the face of adversity, and to never give up on those we love. Sometimes the greatest teachers of humanity are not human. Sometimes they have 4 legs, eyes full of wisdom, and hearts big enough to remind us of what truly matters in life. And if you have a pet at home, take a moment today to look them in the eyes. You might be surprised by the depth of love and intelligence you find there. Leave a comment telling us about your own 4-legged hero, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals, because we all deserve to have a Max in our lives.